I like to have a distinction between financial inclusion and financial access, though, because I think in the kind of more developed economies, it's very much about financial access. It's about access to the underserved or the underbanked. Access to a bank account is not a core issue for many in those markets. But obviously, where you go to less developed economies, it is very much about financial inclusion. It's about unbanked, or individuals or organizations that don't have access to a bank account. It's an important distinction to make. Open banking is, of course, a key part of that journey. It's a key asset, but I think ultimately it's just one part of a much bigger story, right? I mean, opening up access to a bank account, if you don't have a bank account, it's not going to be hugely relevant to you. That initial leg of even access to a bank account is hugely important, and something open banking is not in isolation going to solve. I think there's broader discussions, which is, to your earlier point about open data, that's where the power really lies. In some of these economies where actually not everyone has access to a bank account, but they definitely have access to a phone and a phone network, then the combination of these different areas will add incremental value over time. So I think financial inclusion, if it was easy to solve, we would have solved it by now. We've been talking about financial inclusion for as long as I've probably been in Nuffies. We need to see it as part of open banking, as part of a bigger story around financial inclusion.
Hello, Doreen. It is an absolute pleasure having you in the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Monica. Really happy to be here. I love your podcast. So really honored to be asked to join.
Thank you. Thank you for the feedback. I'm really looking forward to having our conversation. But at the same time, before we go into the detail of the episode, I want to get to know you a little bit more on the personal level, because especially, whether it's life or business, startup or corporate, sometimes life gets tough. We all been there, and that's a very common human experience as such. So I want to start with, how did you deal with the tough times and failure?
Yeah, I think I was mulling this over when you sent some of the draft questions to me, and I was mulling over the kind of concept of failure. And I find it really interesting because at first I didn't really understand the question. I didn't really understand why I didn't understand the question. And then I kind of took that around in my mind for a bit and kind of asked myself why. And I think it's around the concept that I don't really use the word failure or to fail as part of my internal monologue or narrative that we all have with ourselves on a daily basis. It's not really the way I talk to myself. And that's not deliberate. And it's not saying that everything I do is successful, far from it, but it's kind of not the way I view kind of life, and in particular your career or your kind of personal development. I see it much more a way of kind of a chessboard. So, there are times where it's very clear you're making advances in, your personal life or your career, but sometimes, we take very deliberate side steps, or there are challenges that we need to overcome and we need to level set and recheck in with ourselves. And sometimes you take steps backwards, ultimately to the same outcome. So I don't really use the word failure, but I'm quite a resilient person. I really enjoy those challenges and I kind of thrive in those challenges. So it's almost that kind of internal narrative around, okay, well, how can I overcome these? What's the best possible outcome for me in this scenario? And the kind of prisoner's dilemma, how do you get the best out of the situation? And I think, we talk a lot about how we appear in the outside world, but also it's how we talk to ourselves and be kind to ourselves. And some of that is subconscious, but some of that is also very deliberate. So I think that's a bit of a strategy that I've led to deal with over the years.
Yes, I love that. And I think as you were talking, I was like, yeah, I think I do the same thing. It's I don't talk to myself. I'm like, oh, I failed. I never do that. But on the contrary, when it's tough, it's more it is tough and I'm super resilient, but it's more of what am I learning? How do I go about this? And even though sometimes you're it's tough and you're angry or emotional or whatever emotion comes up with the toughness, whether that's personal life or work, but still you are it's more
I like to feel the challenge, feel the toughness.
Yeah, I like that. But I kind of hadn't reflected on that. It was more how did you deal with the tough times? But it's more probably embrace the tough times going forward.
I think we allow ourselves to kind of revel in our successes, right? Which is okay, well, I'm gonna enjoy this for a day or whatever it is. And you see those championships, in tennis and sports, saying, okay, I'm gonna enjoy this for a day, I'm gonna celebrate, and then it's on to work. And that's kind of what we do. And it's also, we should kind of be viewing failure or not succeeding in the way that we had envisioned that way. Let sit with it for a day, be frustrated, and then move on and then kind of get to work. And I think it's treating the success as a failure or the kind of a lack of advancement to be seen kind of similarly.
I love that. That's great career advice for anyone listening.
Hope
No,
so.
but it's true. It's true because, like, I don't know about you, but when I was younger and started my career, no one told me about the when you build your career, you also need to learn how to manage your emotions
Yeah.
throughout your career, especially, well, at some point you're mature enough that you know, right? But while you're learning, you're like, well, yeah, managing your emotions is part of building your career.
You have
So
to
that's
treat work like in a relationship, right? Whether it's your friends or your, lovers or, family, like it's, that they're all relationships that we have, and work is another type of relationship, right? And we have to manage how we deal with those things. And, like you say, if you mature, you're able to set your boundaries, your principles, when time to walk away, when time to invest more, and it's just another extension of other relationships that we have in our life.
exactly, definitely. I learned that as well at some point. I'm like, this is like a relationship.
There's
Like, okay,
hopefully
cool.
not a toxic one, but yeah.
No, 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 no.
Yeah.
Awesome. So talking about career, if you look back in your career, what is the piece of advice that you wish somebody gave you when you were younger?
I mean, I think that, there's a number of things like, yeah, upskill quickly. You know,
Mm.
obviously you're new. People are, in my experience, very welcoming of new people. You're not going to know everything about an industry the minute you walk in the door, and I think very few senior managers would expect that. Um, but take initiative to upskill as quickly as possible. Want to be in the room. Want to be part of the conversation. Okay, yes, you might not be contributing a hell of a lot in the beginning, but be a sponge. Like take every opportunity as a learning opportunity. Um, Things don't happen to you; they happen because of you. So, be present, be listening, be a sponge. I think is really really important. I mean, in our industry, it's primarily a knowledge based industry these days. You need the knowledge, and yes, you can't obviously 30 years working in an industry, but in 30 years time, you want to be ideally one of those people that gets to teach the next generation of fintech entrepreneurs or whatever part of the industry you work within. So I think we see this quite a lot, the different work ethics across different generations, and I see this play out all the time. But it's really really important to take that initiative and, yeah, like I say, be part of the conversation.
Yeah. And I think you've done that really well as well. Well, as part of your job, you're kind of like the expert. You're an expert in open banking and you're quite
That's right.
technical. It's you're seen as one. You're seen as one. But like you really embrace that kind of learning as such. Because open banking, let's say it's relatively new, quote unquote. So
There's so
like
much to learn.
yeah, exactly. And it will continue to evolve. So as we move a little bit more towards the topic, as a subject matter expert, uh, what's your take on how we can build more purpose-driven fintechs?
I think there's a number of things, right? I mean, I come from a primarily a payment background, so I started my career very much in the payment infrastructure space, and we often spoke in those kind of rooms very much as payments, particularly being there is a public good aspect of it. Ultimately, everyone needs to pay and be paid, and I think that's also true of fintech. Obviously, fintech, some business models they want to scale and sell and get out and exit the market, and ultimately, then that public good element is lost. I think, it'd be nice for a percentage of a fintech business to be earmarked towards some kind of public good element, whether that, really making sure that you're driving consumer value, whether that be small businesses, retail consumers, whoever it is, and really making consumers part of the story. I, I see a lot of fintech solutions, they're great, but then when you peel back kind of onion a little bit, and I can say this as someone that's, very much in that kind of infrastructure space, they're arguably not really providing that much value to the end consumer. The clear business objective is to scale to a certain point, have a perceived value, and then exit, which is obviously great for investors and it's great for certain segments of the business. But I think, to earmark a certain proportion to a public good, obviously I'm being very kind of like utopian about the situation. But I think, that would really help drive some of that kind of purpose-built fintech that you're describing. I think as well, spending time, and I think we'll go on to this a bit later, is investing time in understanding what the foundations are for this fintech ecosystem that we're building.
Mm.
What's going to make sure that it survives in 30, 40 years time to continue to drive value and continue to drive purpose? Because we're all so quickly busy getting on with what we're doing that, we don't lift our head above the parapet and have a look at, okay, in 40 years time, is all this stuff we're building going to be fit for purpose? And I come, like I say, from the payments infrastructure background where we're dealing with that situation right now. We've had 60 plus years of legacy infrastructure that we're now dealing with, figuring out how we unwind it or rewire it to be fit for the future. And I think, we want to learn from some of those challenges that we've experienced elsewhere in the industry and not be just very laser focused on the here and now.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. So based on your current expertise, what do you think we need to do now to future proof ourselves for the next 30, 40 years that we are not doing?
I think it's developing an industry strategy around this, right? This is obviously every individual commercial organization has their own strategies around how they want to leverage fintech, the customer bases they want to attract or keep. But I think there's a broader discussion about what the industry strategy is, and everyone needs to be a part of that conversation, from the regulators to, the existing incumbents to, the newer fintech communities, and obviously consumer voices need to be part of that conversation. I think, the regulators particularly have a challenge here because, if you look at the UK and Europe as an example, there's competing regulators, even in financial services, that don't really have a clear story. They don't have a clear picture about what we're trying to achieve in the next 40 years. It's very much the next 3 years or the next 2 years. I think other markets, particularly, your neck of the woods, Monaco and Asia, they have a much clearer picture about the direction over the next at least 20 years, which I think really helps the industry to coalesce around the story and invest in that story. How does it fit within the broader digital agenda of the market? How does it fit in things, conversations around identity and privacy and all of these really big ticket items?
Yeah.
I think some of the kind of, US, UK, Europe market, we're very narrow. We're very short-termist. And I think we need to have a kind of industry strategy around, developing the fintech agenda across the next 40 years.
Yes, I love that because probably exactly like you say, we don't talk about it much. Like, we talk about it, strategy within the company, but it's
Yeah.
not as an industry. What's our vision as an industry for the,
Yeah.
like the leaders of today need to start looking at that. That's a very good thing to think about. I'm like,
And we treat everything
noted.
in isolation. We treat everything in isolation.
Yeah.
Like if you have open banking is obviously a great conversation. It's just, it's my bread and butter at the moment. But we also have things like real-time payments. We have things like identity. We have things like AI, all of these, CBDC to a certain extent. All of these things are somewhat treated in isolation. They're not treated in, okay, well, how do these things tie together to then deliver
to-
what we're trying to
Yeah.
deliver in the future?
Yes.
The convergence
Yes.
piece, that's the holy grail, I guess, for all of us in the
Yeah.
industry at the moment.
Yes. That's such a good point. Exactly. And that's, I think, actually, as I've been thinking about the podcast and the content, I was like, oh, actually, exactly. We need to start putting together all those pieces and then say, hey, what's the bigger problem that we're solving? So giving us tons to think about. We have not even started the
What a
podcast
miracle.
properly. So one of the things that I love about you is that you're a strong leader, and two, you never kind of you embrace your career as being very technical in a very technical and sometimes considered by others boring part of the industry. Like, the detail, but it's amazing that you know that. Can you tell us a bit about your journey and why you decided to know the technical bits?
Yes, I mean, I came into I mean, I would say arguably most people in the industry don't wake up, in their early teens being, yeah, I really want to work in payments. So, I really want to work in this area. So it kind of happened, and it was a fortuitous happening, I must say. So I was a graduate of the recession. There was studied politics. There was no real kind of public sector jobs at that time. I'd always envisioned I would work for government. Um, and there was this job that was going on what was then called Payment Council, and I'm sure some of your listeners, particularly in the UK, will be very familiar with that. And they were really responsible at that time, given the government mandate for payments infrastructure, but also kind of traditional trade body activities. And I was recruited into the standards department of that team, of that organisation, which was really gearing toward technical standards delivery for payments infrastructure. So you could argue quite a techy role, even though I wasn't responsible for the implementation of those standards. It was, assessing what was the right approach for the market. And it was a real sweet spot for me because standards and to a certain extent, part of those infrastructure discussions, they're also heavily linked to policy decisions. Someone somewhere is saying, this is the reason why this particular standard needs to be implemented in the confines of a business requirement or an industry requirement. And that would kind of really resonated with me, because I do like to get into the detail of things, but I also like the kind of business drivers, the reason behind doing it. So it kind of married the two perfectly for me. And I am not a deep techie. I'm not sitting there writing code or anything like that, but I like to understand the impact of change on, for those that are actually going to go and have to implement this stuff, right? It's all easy, particularly as business people or as policy people, to say, oh, we must do this. This is a really good idea. And have no understanding whatsoever of how actually this is implemented in practice. What it really takes from the technical side to make it happen. And I think, that's a gap, that's a vacuum in our own shop. And I like to kind of help to bridge that gap. To talk a little bit to the techies, but also obviously understanding the business drivers about why the stuff is really important. So yeah, and I kind of really enjoy that sweet spot between, the regulatory / business agenda and then the technical impact of what we're getting there. Yeah.
Awesome. I love that you said you'd like to see the impact of change. I'm like, yeah, that's a very good career driver as well. But it's like, yeah, it keeps me motivated. Whatever we're doing at work.
Yeah.
When we see the impact, it makes it very relevant.
And if you're kind of like me, like this is an industry I anticipate I'll spend my entire career in, and change is often slow, particularly at an industrial level. You want to be invested in that change. You want to see the impact. Probably the fruits of my labor in some instances I'm not going to see for at least another decade, if I'm lucky. So you kind of have to be invested in that slow kind of course of change and kind of take it wherever you can get it.
Exactly. I'll just do a little break. Your screen went black. So I don't know, do you see yourself? Because I have a note here that says actual recording is higher quality. But if you see yourself, then it should be fine.
Yeah, I can see myself. I can see
You can see yourself. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm back. Okay, cool.
Okay.
Then we can continue. Yes.
I can see us both. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Cool.
Cool.
Okay, so moving on. There are these terms that we hear in the industry, in LinkedIn. And I believe we may not really understand what they are. And if we don't understand what they are in detail, then we cannot have a proper conversation. Like you said, like we cannot go and implement something if we don't really know the impact of what we're talking about. So can you expand on what is the difference between open banking, open data, and open finance?
Sure, I can do that. So, essentially all three, in its purest sense, is third-party access to a customer's account with their explicit consent, right? So this is allowing not the traditional front door shop that you would access these services, whether it be a bank, whether it be another financial service provider, whether it be a telco, for example. Is it third parties being able to access those accounts on your behalf with your consent? Now, this has been going on since roughly like 1980, but it's been happening through essentially unregulated, unauthorized green scraping. So it's where the financial service provider hasn't known that the fintech has been accessing these customer accounts through screen scraping behind closed doors. So we're now seeing a shift, and this has been going on, like I say, since 1980, when the German post office conducted its first screen test. And, this isn't new by any stretch. The US has had open banking for, 20 years in that kind of realm. What we're now talking about is using newer technology, APIs, application programming interfaces, for the secure sharing of that data. Open data, open finance, open banking is really just then what data can be shared. So open banking is very much around the transactional account base. So your checking account, your current account, really minimal data set being shared. In open finance, that's then broadened down to all different kinds of financial products. So you're sharing your mortgage data, your pension data, perhaps insurance, perhaps some investments you hold, So that data set around the type of financial products that you're then sharing with those parties increases. Taking that a step further to open data, it's then not just financial data anymore. It's things like perhaps your health data, your information you have with your telco provider, even energy. So it then takes it beyond just the financial realm and into any really big utility business that sits on large pools of customer data can then also be exposed. So, obviously as an industry, we're on that journey. Most markets are just scratching the surface of open banking. Others are a little bit more advanced, but yeah, we're really, really at the early stages of this, and it is very much a journey.
Yes, and that's why this conversation is so relevant, because it's just the beginning of the journey, which then takes
So,
me to, can you, because there's many players in the open banking space as such as well. So can you tell us, what does open banking exchange do? Why are you different from all the other open banking people?
yes, and there are so many right now. Open Banking Exchange is part of a broader group called Consensus. So Open Banking Exchange focuses very much on assessed advisory capabilities. The whole group is entirely open banking focused. So we live and breathe this stuff. We have been since 2015, 2016, when open banking was in the very early, or regulated open banking was in the very early stages in the UK and Europe. So we've been living and breathing this stuff for some time now. But Open Banking Exchange focuses very much on advising central banks, regulators, market infrastructures on how to deploy an open banking ecosystem that is essentially fit for purpose. What are you trying to achieve, and how can you achieve it through, whether it's regulated, through governance regime, through centralized infrastructure? We really help them map out the road to success. And in the wider part of the business, we also support the trust layer of open banking ecosystem. So we know very much that trust is a huge issue when deploying open banking, and it's critical to its success. So we provide essentially a technology layer that enables financial institutions, third-party fintechs to all understand the roles and responsibilities that everyone plays, and in real time, so that everyone can feel comfortable with sharing that, really crucial, sensitive customer data with each other. So we like to call ourselves experts in this field. I think, that's a fair assumption, living and breathing this stuff for so many years now, but we really kind of focus on those national implementations, making sure that everyone has their fair building blocks to build a successful open banking ecosystem.
I love that, because, like you say, it's about building blocks, it's about having the foundations, it's about being a journey, which then leads me to, what is the journey of building these what is the journey of building these foundational layers, so that then we can innovate and even actually kind of have more financial inclusion?
Yes, I mean, in our view, there isn't a cookie cutter kind of style. We hear this all the time, like, oh, but can't I just implement what they've done over there? And I mean, yeah, literally, in theory, you can, but it's not necessarily going to provide the correct foundation for your market. As we've seen everywhere, it's the same, to a certain extent with payments. Retail banking and payments are so culturally linked that, what works in the UK is not necessarily going to work in Singapore, or work in, Colombia, or elsewhere. So it's very much building on those kind of best of breed practices and taking them into a market and making adapting them where they make sense. Financial inclusion is obviously a key policy agenda item for many markets out there. I like to have a distinction between financial inclusion and financial access, though, because I think in the kind of more developed economies, it's very much about financial access. It's about access to the underserved or the underbanked. Access to a bank account is not a core issue for many in those markets. But obviously, where you go to less developed economies, it is very much about financial inclusion. It's about unbanked, or individuals or organizations that don't have access to a bank account. So I think, that it's an important distinction to make. Open banking is, of course, a key part of that journey. It's a key asset, but I think ultimately it's just one part of a much bigger story, right? I mean, opening up access to a bank account, if you don't have a bank account, it's not going to be hugely relevant to you. So I think that, that initial leg of even access to a bank account is hugely important, and something open banking is not in isolation going to solve. I think there's broader discussions, which is, to your earlier point about open data. That's where the power really lies. In some of these economies where actually not everyone has access to a bank account, but they definitely have access to a phone, and a phone network, then the combination of these different areas will add, incremental value over time. So I think, financial inclusion, if it was easy to solve, we would have solved it by now. We've been talking about financial inclusion for, as long as, I've probably been in nappies, but I think we need to see it as part of what open banking is, part of a bigger story around financial inclusion.
Definitely. And what is the role of legislation and the regulator in all this story?
Yeah, we get asked this quite a lot, actually. I mean, our view is some form of regulation is helpful. However, we've also seen markets where open banking has been exceptionally successful in the absence of regulation. arguably the US in terms of access to customer accounts is one of the most successful open banking markets on the planet. That's not regulated. Now, that being said, the regulator is probably going to step in over the next few months and make some changes to that. But, open banking has been able to thrive there. So I think we really have to be careful about what we mean by regulation and the role it can play. Likewise, in Asia, Singapore, classic example, not regulated at all, but arguably very successful. But they also have a very, very different regulated to industry dynamic that doesn't exist in many other markets. So I think, if you look at Europe, open banking would never have happened if it wasn't for regulation. I pretty much assure you of that. And I would say likewise of the UK, or at least not in the way that we have it today. So for me, regulation is a really useful building block, enables us all to understand the rules of the game. So what fintechs are able to participate, under what rules are they able to participate? In some instances, common standards, which makes it much easier for both the FIs and the banks to develop services and products around it, because there's a baseline kind of level set for everyone. So I think it's a really critical building block in many markets, but not for every market. And we've done quite a bit of analysis on this, where the single question that we ask at the beginning is, do you have to regulate? Can you achieve the same objectives that you're trying to achieve without it? Because you don't necessarily want to go down that road if you don't have to.
I love it. It's the first time that it's kind of, really like there's evidence of markets, not companies, but like markets on its own, where this works with or without regulation for different reasons. And then we need to ask ourselves, do you really need to regulate it? Does it,
Yeah, and
like, what's the role of regulation in this specific picture, in this specific context? I
regulators
love doing that
everywhere,
challenge.
yeah,
Yeah.
they have so much FOMO at the moment. Regulators, they're all looking at each other. Oh, they're doing CBDC over there. I need to do CBDC here. Oh, they're doing open banking over there. I better do open banking over here. And we kind of constantly say, take time, sit down. It's not going anywhere. Figure out whether this is what you want to do, and you're going to achieve your policy objectives by delivering this. And if that's the case, then what's the best implementation method for your market to get to those objectives? And really sit with it and have the time and do the work. Don't just kind of rush through, regulation that you're going to regret in a year's time.
I totally love it. And I think many people who are building fintechs love that too. But you also touched on standards, which are quite important as well, because it makes the industry work well together as such. And recently, many of us, including myself, there is a new standard that is PSD3.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to us? What does this entail?
So, PSD3, is a new piece of regulation that the European Commission has come out with in a whole suite of regulatory measures that they bestowed quite nicely on the industry over the summer period. In my mind, PSD3, and I know there'll be some out there, and I've had this conversation with a few guys on LinkedIn, it's not hugely exciting, let's be honest. It's taking some of the, I would say, regulatory detriments of PSD2 and trying to plug the gaps a little bit. So there's some interesting kind of nuggets around strong customer authentication, but arguably it's not hugely riveting stuff here. I would say the FIDA regulation, which is financial data access, is where everyone should be looking right now. This takes not only all of the negatives of PSD2, but also and tries to mitigate some of those, albeit still very challengingly, but also then takes it to a step further. So this is really the start of open finance in Europe now. This is pretty much every possible financial product you can imagine is now in scope of opening up to third parties. So mortgages, pensions, insurance, investment vehicles, crypto assets, other digital assets, everything now has to be exposed to third parties. And not only does it have to be exposed to third parties, it has to be exposed in a standardized way, which wasn't the case with open banking, 4 or 5 years ago. And it has to be developed within the confines of one or more schemes. So essentially creating a governance structure now for open finance in Europe, which again wasn't there before.
Yeah. What's your take? I find this very, very exciting. I'm like, oh, this is super exciting.
Exciting, Monica, it is.
Yes, because then I'm like, it opens a world of possibilities on innovation and the potential products that we can do. And I'm thinking without thinking of all the restrictions that I'll have, but I'm like, oh, just imagine
I mean,
That is
if you look
like,
at open banking, transactional accounts are not very interesting. Like, there's not my current account is not hugely interesting. It's not hugely insightful. Okay, yeah, I may have another bank account with another bank that, okay, it's nice to compare the two, but ultimately my world is not going to change. When you start to get into, okay, well, actually, I can now view my pension, I can now view my different insurance products, I can now maybe have some money set aside in some kind of investment fund, whatever the case may be, or mortgages and things like that, then you're providing essentially financial portfolio for every individual customer. And when you talk about things like financial access and financial literacy, that's hugely powerful now. It becomes much more
yes,
exciting, and the fintech opportunity is vast.
I loved it. I'm really looking forward to the innovations that will happen as a result of this.
So, me too. I mean, we may be a
Definitely.
few years away from it yet, but I'm excited to see what's going to happen.
Yes. Which leads me to, this is going to force fintechs and banks to innovate, and it's going to force them to have a little bit of more of a competitive side to each of them, because now our information will be more open across all the financial products. So, what's your take on open banking, open data, fostering competition and innovation?
I mean, I think again, this is a journey, right? So I think particularly in Europe, the banks or at least in the short term, is very much a compliance exercise. At least across the bank accounts that I have in both the UK and Europe, I haven't seen a huge amount of innovative products off the back of open banking. That being said, I can pay my tax bill in the UK using open banking payments. So there are definite use cases that have trickled down to me as a consumer. But I think we're still in the very early stages of meaningful consumer experiences. I know there are fintechs out there that will say the opposite, but if I put my consumer hat on, I'm not seeing a huge amount of those in my day-to-day life. Um, but I think as open finance starts to take off, we will start to see that competition edge out even more. And I think banks will start to compete with each other a bit more, where there's more value in it for them. I mean, most transactional accounts in Europe are either free or they're a minimal cost. So the competition element is not so pronounced. But when you're talking about big ticket items like mortgages and stuff like that, then I think, the competitive advantage becomes more real for the bank. I think obviously competition in the fintech space is much more fierce. They're competing for, some of the embedded finance kind of conversations with merchants. It becomes a much more fierce conversation. Some of them are really vying for that kind of. I think the competitive element amongst the fintechs is real. I'm seeing less of the competition between banks and fintech than we had thought there would be at the beginning. So I think one of
Yeah.
the conversations was very much, these fintechs are going to eat all the bank revenue, they're going to steal all the bank customers. And ultimately, we haven't really seen that materialize yet. Maybe it will as open finance starts to progress, but at least in these stages, I think the banks are still very much, front and center of the consumer experience.
Strong. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's interesting because, well, I was part of one of the first neobanks fintechs in the UK. This is 8 years ago. And the narrative started back then, right? Like, oh, yeah, the
Yeah.
fintechs are going to eat the bank's launch. And then a few years later, it's like, oh, yeah, banks are paying attention to fintechs. But it's been 8 years and it's still not
No,
that disruptive. And probably we all still have our bank account with our main bank and
exactly.
the bank with a big brand that has been there forever and some fintechs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's some really interesting statistics about, I don't know them off the top of my head, around in the UK at least, it's a significant percentage of people, I mean, well into the 80s, 90s, that get paid their salary into their main bank account with one of the top 9 banks in the UK. They're not getting paid into a neobank, Wise or a Revolut or whoever. They're using those for supplementary services that they maybe can't access through their bank or to enhance that experience. But their primary account is not with those organizations. And I think that's the kind of balance, at least, that we'll continue to see in the short term. Fintech will enhance these offerings, not lessen them.
Yes, because I think it's also about trust. Somehow, as exciting, well, and I'm the biggest fan of fintech, right? But as exciting as it can be, or innovative, or easy, or whatever, you still, well, it's a Barclays, it's an HSBC, it's a Lloyd's, it's a City, these are like big brands,
Right.
established banks that give you kind of confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And they've been around for a long, long time. They invest serious amounts of money, both from a marketing perspective and from an infrastructure perspective, to keep that trusted kind of brand. Yeah, some of the banks, particularly in Northern Europe, for example, they're some of the most trusted brands in the country, not just within finance, within everything. So, they deserve to continue to keep that spot. I mean, I think what I really like, and I've seen some of the banks in Asia do this, and in Singapore, and I kind of hope that this kind of trend or model will take off in Europe and the UK, is the banking apps are so strong. They have, and they've really leveraged open banking, AI, EID, that convergence that we were talking about earlier on. They've really brought that to life for the consumer in their own app. I as a consumer want an app like that. And I'm annoyed that in the UK I don't have that. And all of those, I mean, we don't have EID, but apart from EID, all of the other building blocks are there, right? We have real-time payments, we have open banking, banks are obviously testing and using AI to a certain degree. There's no reason why I can't have that app in my home market. The banks just don't offer that. So I think, there are really exciting things that the banks can be doing for their retail customers. And there are banks out there that are taking advantage of those things and taking advantage of the fintech opportunity.
Yes. So that makes me think, because we've been talking about innovation and basically how open banking, open data, open finance can change everything for consumers and for financial inclusion as well. But it makes me think, with anything, the more I have these conversations, it's it is not about technology. It's never about technology.
No.
It's
No.
culture is one of the biggest either propellers or setbacks on how we're going to solve any of these challenges of money, stress, and financial inclusion.
Yeah.
Because then it's mindset
It's my dad. It's
across
exactly
the
how.
industry. Across the industry.
And that's top down. I mean, we have conversations quite frequently in the open banking space. Open banking is generally not a vote winning policy agenda item. It's not someone, if you're a potential future government and you go to lobby for open banking ahead of an election, one, you're lucky if anyone cares. And two, if they do care, it's probably going to be negative, because it's very difficult to pitch open banking to the average retail consumer as a positive thing. Even though it is, they'll see the security risk, all of those associated conversations. So it really takes actually quite a, and I guess it's the same with, senior management within banks. Ultimately, they don't want to be responsible for a data breach, or they don't want to be responsible for creating a product that fails or doesn't make any revenue or doesn't hit their targets. So, there's this balance between, and ultimately I have this conversation quite a lot, but banks aren't charities at the end of the day.
No.
They also need to make money, and they will ultimately drive products where there's revenue to be made. And I think they haven't cottoned on to, or at least maybe it's starting to change, is that stickiness within a bank's environment is what will keep customers coming back and what will keep customers wanting to use their products and services. And that's fine with there's no fintechs that can offer the same service, but maybe in the future with new generations that have less of that relationship with the larger bank, will be quite happy to, like you say, have their salary in a neobank or in a fintech provider. So I think the banks are in this kind of interesting position. I think, creating that stickiness, creating that value add is still really, really important. And it might not necessarily convert to hardline pounds and pence or euros and cents, but will keep customers engaged.
Yeah, right. Exactly, because within the bank, it's the create the stickiness within the ecosystem. For now, for customers, probably millennials upwards and some of the Gen Zs. But the alpha generation, when they become young adults and they are 18, 20, 23, 25, by then, all these fintechs will not be a new thing. They will be totally established across the world. And it may be that they are oh, but the banks are kind of old. I'd rather use the new, right? And then it will become an issue for the banks, what we were just talking about, trust, that it's like their biggest asset, may not be there for the alpha generation. That's
Well, or they may
big.
be trusted, but trust might not be the reason why that generation cares to engage in financial services.
Exactly.
Trust is really important to me and to my generation, but for future generations, trust might not be the selling point anymore. And I look at my niece, and she's of a certain age, and even some of these social networks, she's past it. She finds them totally antiquated. Instagram, who wants to use Instagram? She's on TikTok and Snapchat and all of these other things that I wouldn't have the faintest interest in using. And I think that's exactly it. All of these things that we think are really new and interesting and exciting, they think already they're all hacked. They're boring. They're not interesting at all. So I kind of think that the same mentality applies to kind of financial services, right? And I think there's lots of industries out there. I read a really interesting article the other day about a large UK news network. Some of their coverage of the Ukraine war and all of these other types of things, they're a 24-hour rolling news station, right? So, and they have YouTube, they're 24 hours, they have everything. Some of their biggest viewership is on TikTok and Snapchat. Like, and you're talking millions and millions of views, whereas the TV station is almost diminishing now. But I think it's finding a way to access these newer customers, or people that aren't even customers yet. They're going to be customers in maybe 15 years' time.
Yes. And this comes back to the beginning of the conversation that we were talking about, the having a strategy for the industry.
Yep.
And we need people to start thinking about the next 20, 30, 40 years, not just today and tomorrow, in 3 years' time max. Also,
we need to invest in our future, Monica, you see.
we do. Which takes us back to your original point. We need to study and learn and knowledge, because that's the future as well.
Exactly
It's
that.
been a fascinating conversation. I want to, as we move closer to the end of the chat, I want to go back to you rather than open banking as such.
Mm-hmm.
So you are quite an accomplished professional in the industry. You are in the board at the Open Banking Expo. You are the chair of ISO TC 68 CS2 Security Financial Services. That sounds like a very long thing. Yeah, you've previously run your payments consultancy firm. Like, you're super accomplished. So, my question: how did you get into a role in a board? And the reason why I'm asking is because it's also coming from the diversity perspective. That it's like, I do believe that we need to have those role models and show them to other people that are currently not in those roles, to say, oh yeah, I can get there. But many times they don't know how to get there. So yeah, how did you get into the board?
Yeah, so from Open Banking Exchange's point of view, we've built up quite a degree of credibility in this space. Like I said before, if you're in the knowledge-based industry that we are, at least as a professional services company, our bread and butter is the knowledge that we have in our heads. And you really have to be at the front and center of the game, right? You have to have the most up-to-date knowledge that there is on this subject. In Open Banking Exchange, we've built up that credibility in the market. Essentially, organizationally, we were offered that role to sit on the advisory board, obviously to support Open Banking Expo. I thankfully work for a great organization that is, very pro-diversity, and I essentially stuck my hand up and said, this is something I really want to do, something I feel really passionate about. And luckily has the leadership, really supportive leadership team that was cognizant of my abilities and very happy and trustworthy to be in that position. And I'm conscious that, that's not always the case. And, I've heard some pretty awful stories in the industry that still exist of that not being the case. But I think it's a combination of, in my mind, you have to be good at what you do. And this is why, the knowledge part of it is so important. But I think from a leadership perspective, it's also, you have to be conscious of allowing those, from diverse backgrounds. And I say this not just as a gender issue, it's a diversity issue across the board, allowing them to take those positions. And I kind of think one of my key kind of next things that I want to get involved in is the kind of diversity question, because we see a lot of these kind of women in payments, women in open banking, women in the next thing. And I think, the industry in general is lacking kind of a lot of diversity, whether that's, religious or race or otherwise. And I think that's the next step for me is to kind of get more active in that space.
Awesome. I love I also want to get more active on the diversity space, but it's
Yeah.
what I love. I personally, Monica, I've come to realize that I love living in the UK and I love living in Malaysia because of diversity. When I was in
Mm-hmm.
Mexico, it was just like Mexicans. That's it.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
when I was in the UK, it was like, oh, there's people from everywhere. And then here in
Yeah.
Malaysia, there's like it's a very diverse country. And with
It is.
that comes diversity of thought, diversity of
Absolutely.
ideas, arguments, this, the other. And I'm like, oh, that is super cool. It's not a gender diversity equality. No, it's let's
It's
bring
everything.
different views to the table.
Yeah. Exactly. Because I think, and I often find that these kind of, women in open banking, which, they're all fantastic forums, like really fantastic. And it's great, sounding board, obviously, for newer generations and stuff. Exactly, how do you get into leadership positions? How do you tackle these situations? They're great forums for those. But I think what we're lacking in general is, what is it about different voices that are required at the policy level, required at the business level, required at the technical level, in all different parts of the industry? Because sometimes when it's a conversation of, women in whatever, it's really a conversation about women in tech.
Yeah.
But actually we need women in policy, because these are shaping the decisions, shaping, the policy objectives of the country, and that it shouldn't just be women, all walks of life. And same with, women in product, setting up women in product roles, because ultimately women use these products, so they have a different potentially way of thinking or using them. So I think it's not just viewing financial services as well as just like one thing. Like, there are so many different layers to financial services that need to be, fully diverse.
That is spot on because you cannot the financial services industry as such is quite complex.
Yeah.
So we cannot
Yeah.
solve real problems without including all of the elements within the industry. And then within each of the elements of the industry have diversity on each teams as such.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we'll be in a good place. We'll be in a good place for developing for the future.
Yes, I think we're doing the work today for
Yeah.
the future, which
We
is
need to run
amazing.
the industry, Monica.
It's like, well, we're very active. Exactly.
Yeah.
Both of us are very active, so we are influencing. At least that's what we need. That's what we
No, I love
think
it.
about.
I love it.
It's been a pleasure having you in the show. Where can we find more about you and Open Banking Exchange?
So obviously we're active on all of the kind of main social media networks. We also have our website, www.census.com, and openbanking.exchange, where you can find more information about all the products and services that we offer. But equally, if you're implementing open banking at a national level, please do get in touch.
Exactly. And I'll add all the details in the show notes.
Exactly.
As a very last question, if you could change one thing, just one thing in the industry that could make lives better for customers, staff, and shareholders, what would that be?
I mean, I think there's so many things. But one is, I think I'd love to get to a place where we can have, really proactive decisions around lowering the cost of infrastructure. I think it's a really, back to your point about unsexy, it's really unsexy, but ultimately,
Like, wow.
the cost of infrastructure, the ecosystem becomes much more accessible. We can reduce inequality. There are so many trickle-on positive effects that, not having to invest huge sums of money in infrastructure. And the technology is there these days, right? We just again, back to your mindset point. And I think my ask to the regulators is, let the industry breathe. There's so much regulation going on. There's so many mandatory, change items that, one, it's hard to even see where success is, or whether we've been successful in deploying any of these regulatory initiatives. Let the industry breathe. Let their time to take stock and reassess before we get on to the next thing. And I think that, one of the other key things for me is work with other industries. To the financial inclusion point, financial services is not in isolation. We need to work with other industries to build products that can work across a range of use cases, range of customers, range of scenarios. And I think we just need to get a lot better at that.
Awesome. Yeah, I totally agree that we need to cross-pollinate if we want to really
That's the
solve
word,
for financial
cross-pollinate.
inclusion. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure, Lorraine. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you so
joining
much.
us. And
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, Monica. Thanks so much for asking me to join.
thank you. Everyone, see you next week. Ciao, ciao.
Thanks, everyone.
It was really cool.